The Galactic Council had strict protocols about dark space anomalies. Every spacefaring species knew to avoid these regions where physics seemed to break down and reality became questionable. Every species except humans. Of course. Captain Chen, you are directly violating Section 7.3 of the Spatial Navigation Charter. The Arxian representative's crystalline form flickered with agitation on the view screen. Turn your vessel around immediately. Sarah Chen, commander of the research vessel Curiosity, smiled that peculiar human smile that always made other species uncomfortable. With all due respect, Ambassador, we're picking up patterns in the quantum fluctuations. There's something in there trying to communicate. The Arxian's crystalline structure nearly shattered in horror. Patterns in a dark space anomaly. Captain, your species' tendency to find meaning in chaos will get you killed. These regions are designated as hazardous for a reason. But Sarah had spent 3 years studying this particular anomaly from a distance. While other species saw random energy bursts and spatial distortions, she saw something different. The bursts came in sets of 3, always followed by a precise 13-second pause. The distortions, when mapped in 4 dimensions, created structures too regular to be random. Dr. Rivera, she called to her chief physicist, begin the harmonic resonance sequence. The human crew worked with practiced efficiency, their apparent calm a stark contrast to the panicking alien observers. They had prepared for this moment, developed technologies that seemed absurd to other species, devices that generated controlled chaos, as they called it. The Curiosity's specialized arrays began emitting carefully calculated bursts of energy, mimicking the patterns they'd observed but with subtle variations. It was like a conversation in quantum mechanics, a dance of probability and possibility. Captain, you're going to tear apart the fabric of space-time, the Arxian warned. Sarah watched as the anomaly's energy patterns shifted, responding to their transmissions. No, Ambassador. We're about to make first contact with something that's been trying to talk to us for centuries. The reason other species couldn't hear it is because they were too afraid to listen. The dark space before them began to shimmer, and where others saw danger, Sarah saw beauty. The quantum fluctuations coalesced into structures that defied traditional physics, but followed their own elegant logic. And then, through the chaos of numbers and probability, came a voice. Not in words, but in pure mathematics. Hello, it said through equations and quantum states. We have waited so long for someone to answer. The beings within the anomaly, as it turned out, existed in a state of quantum superposition. They experienced all possibilities simultaneously and had been reaching out to the universe through the only means they could, patterns in chaos. But their attempts at communication appeared as dangerous anomalies to species that relied too heavily on classical physics and rigid logic. Only humans, with their peculiar ability to recognize patterns where others saw randomness, their willingness to embrace uncertainty, and their almost irrational courage to reach out into the unknown, could bridge this gap. As the Curiosity's crew established the first real dialogue with these quantum beings, the Arxian ambassador watched in stunned silence. Perhaps for the first time, a non-human species began to understand why humans' seemingly illogical approaches to the universe might not be so illogical after all. Sarah turned to the still shocked ambassador. You see, sometimes what looks like chaos is just a different kind of order. We humans might seem irrational to the rest of the galaxy, but that's because we've learned that the universe itself isn't always rational, at least, not in the way most species define rationality. The quantum beings shared knowledge that would revolutionize understanding of spacetime, but more importantly, they offered a profound lesson to the galaxy. Sometimes, the most meaningful discoveries come not from avoiding what we don't understand, but from having the courage to reach out and listen to it. As news spread across the galaxy, other species began to look at humans differently. Perhaps their peculiar way of thinking, their ability to find patterns in chaos, and their willingness to reach into the unknown, wasn't a sign of primitive recklessness after all. Perhaps it was exactly what the galaxy needed to evolve beyond its self-imposed limitations. The Void Whisperers, as they came to be known, were just the beginning. Humanity's unique perspective would soon unlock other mysteries that the more logical species had been too rigid to even recognize as mysteries at all. Maya Rodriguez had a peculiar habit that made her fellow cargo pilots laugh and alien dock workers shake their heads in bewilderment. She collected space debris, not the valuable kind that could be salvaged for profit, but the tiny, seemingly worthless fragments that most ships' automated systems filtered out and ignored. How many useless pieces of junk have you added to your collection today? Captain Nick Starr of the Valorian Trade Authority asked during a routine cargo inspection. His 4 eyes blinked in synchronized confusion as Maya carefully stored another fragment in her specialized containment unit. 17, she replied cheerfully, examining the latest addition through her augmented reality display. And they're not junk. Each piece tells a story. The Valorian captain's scales shifted to a shade of purple that indicated mild amusement mixed with pity. Your species' obsession with finding meaning in randomness continues to baffle us. Maya just smiled, used to such reactions. For 3 years, she'd been mapping the debris she collected, logging their composition, trajectory, and the quantum signature each piece carried. Other species saw these fragments as cosmic litter, but Maya saw them as breadcrumbs scattered across space. It was during a routine cargo run to the Centauri colonies that her hobby suddenly proved its worth. Her ship's sensors picked up an unusual concentration of debris, the kind she'd been collecting, forming a distinct trail through an otherwise empty sector. Central Control, requesting permission to deviate from standard route for investigation. Maya transmitted. Negative. Cargo vessel TX-1138, came the immediate response. Maintain designated shipping lane. Deviation is inefficient and unnecessary. But Maya had spent too long studying these fragments to ignore what she was seeing. The debris trail formed a pattern she'd never encountered before, a deliberate arrangement that defied natural space phenomena. She made her decision. Central Control, invoking Emergency Protocol 7A, possible security concern detected. It wasn't strictly true, but it gave her the authority to investigate. Following the trail, Maya discovered something that made her collection suddenly make perfect sense. The debris wasn't random at all. It was a message system, created by an ancient species that had mastered quantum entanglement on a scale previously thought impossible. Each fragment contained quantum-entangled particles that, when properly aligned, formed a vast communication network spanning the galaxy. The ancient species had created this network as a backup plan, knowing their civilization was facing extinction. They left behind their knowledge, encoded in what everyone else dismissed as space junk. This is incredible. Dr. Sarah Chen's voice crackled over the quantum comm. The Curiosity's discovery of the Void Whisperers had made her humanity's leading expert on unconventional communication. The quantum signatures in your debris collection match the mathematical patterns we've been receiving from the quantum beings. Maya's useless hobby had uncovered the connection between the Void Whisperers and an ancient civilization that had once bridged the gap between classical and quantum existence. The debris network wasn't just a communication system. It was a manual, a guide to understanding the quantum beings and the true nature of space-time itself. As Maya helped coordinate the effort to decode the ancient messages, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been literally throwing away pieces of the greatest discovery in their history, all because they couldn't see past their preconceptions of what was valuable and worthless. You know what the funny thing is? Maya said to Dr. Chen during one of their decoding sessions. If any other species had started collecting this debris, their sophisticated filtering systems would have categorized the quantum signatures as corruption and cleaned them out. Sometimes the most advanced technology can blind you to the simplest truths. The discovery revolutionized galactic communication and led to breakthroughs in quantum physics that even the most advanced civilizations hadn't thought possible. But perhaps more importantly, It taught the galaxy another lesson about human nature. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from looking for something specific, but from simply being curious enough to look at all. As news of Maya's discovery spread, her fellow cargo pilots stopped laughing at her haughty. The Valorian Trade Authority even issued a formal directive requiring all ships to preserve and catalog space debris for further study. And Maya, she just kept collecting her fragments, knowing there were still more stories out there, hidden in what others chose to ignore. Dr. James Kumar stood before the Galactic Council's emergency session, his hand steady as he manipulated the holographic display showing the Cassiopeia sector's gravitational readings. The council chamber, usually a model of order and decorum, buzzed with barely contained panic. With all due respect, Dr. Kumar, High Counselor Zix of the Meridian Collective, spoke, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with anxiety. Your proposal is madness. You cannot fight gravitational collapse with more chaos. The situation was dire. A chain reaction of collapsed quantum fields was threatening to tear apart an entire sector of space, home to 17 settled systems and billions of lives. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had tried everything in their considerable technological arsenal to halt the collapse, and nothing had worked. Actually, Counselor, James replied, his voice calm despite the stakes. Chaos is exactly what we need. The universe isn't a machine. It's more like a symphony. Sometimes you need to add more instruments to bring the music back into harmony. He gestured to the holographic display, where the chaotic patterns of the collapse swirled in threatening reds and blacks. To the other species present, it looked like pure entropy, the breakdown of order itself. But James saw something different. He saw a rhythm. Look here, he pointed to a particular pattern. The collapse isn't random. It's following a complex but recognizable pattern, similar to what we've learned from the Void Whisperers and the Ancient Network. The discovery of the quantum beings and the debris network had revolutionized understanding of spacetime, but many species still struggle to embrace the less orderly implications of these discoveries. They wanted the universe to follow neat, predictable rules. The collapse is accelerating because we're fighting it wrong, James continued. Every attempt to impose order is actually making it worse. We need to work with the chaos, not against it. His team had developed what they called chaos resonators, devices that could generate controlled gravitational distortions based on the same principles they'd learned from studying the quantum beings. The plan was to create a carefully orchestrated series of chaotic events that would, paradoxically, bring the sector back into balance. It's like jazz, James explained, earning blank looks from the alien counselors. Sometimes the best way to resolve discord is to add more notes, but they have to be the right notes, played at exactly the right time. The council deliberated for what felt like eternity, while the collapse continued to spread. Finally, with no other options remaining, they gave their approval. Not because they understood or believed in James's theory, but because they had run out of alternatives. What followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Hundreds of ships, equipped with chaos resonators, moved into position around the affected sector. Following James's calculations, they began generating gravitational distortions that, to any outside observer, looked like they were making the situation worse. The collapse expanded, the chaos increased, and several counselors demanded the experiment be stopped. But James held firm, watching his instruments with intense concentration. He wasn't just looking at the data, he was listening to it, feeling its rhythm, understanding its dance. Now, he commanded, and all the ships activated their resonators at full power. The resulting gravitational chaos was spectacular, a dance of forces that defied traditional physics. For one terrifying moment, it seemed like the entire sector would be torn apart. Then, gradually, the chaos began to organize itself. The collapse started to reverse, not through the imposition of order, but through the emergence of a new kind of stability, one born from the chaos itself. As the sector stabilized, the council chamber erupted in relief and celebration. But James was already reviewing the data, fascinated by what they'd learned. The universe, it seemed, sometimes needed a little chaos to maintain its balance. How did you know it would work? High Counselor Zix asked later, their bioluminescence now showing patterns of curiosity mixed with respect. James smiled. Humans have always understood something that many advanced civilizations forget. Chaos and order aren't opposites. They're partners in a dance that's been going on since the beginning of time. Sometimes you have to trust the dance. The events in the Cassiopeia sector became known as the Symphony Solution, and it marked another turning point in how the galaxy viewed human intuition. Perhaps their seemingly chaotic approach to problem-solving wasn't a sign of primitive thinking after all. Perhaps they simply understood a deeper truth about the nature of reality itself. Ambassador Aisha Patel had broken every rule in the diplomatic handbook, and the Galactic Council's Department of Conflict Resolution was in an uproar. In the middle of the most delicate peace negotiations in recent history, she had switched off all quantum recorders, dismissed all AI diplomatic assistants, and invited the two warring species to what humans called a dinner party. The Nexians and the Vortex Collective had been fighting for control of the Orion Arm for over 3 centuries. Both species were renowned for their logical approach to everything, which made their inability to resolve this conflict particularly ironic. This is highly irregular. First speaker X427 of the Nexians stated, their crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated severe discomfort. Diplomatic protocols clearly state, with respect, first speaker, Aisha interrupted, setting down a steaming bowl of what she had dubbed universal comfort food, a specially designed dish that triggered pleasant sensory responses in most species. Sometimes protocols are part of the problem. The Vortex Collective's representative, a swirling mass of conscious energy contained within a diplomatic field, flickered in what might have been agreement, or indigestion. After 3 months of formal negotiations, this was the first time Aisha had seen any reaction from them that wasn't completely predictable. You both pride yourselves on your logical approach to everything, Aisha continued, serving the unusual meal. But logic alone clearly hasn't solved this conflict. Perhaps it's time to try something illogical. The dinner that followed would have given any traditional diplomat a heart attack, or the equivalent in their species. Aisha deliberately steered the conversation away from territory disputes and resource rights, instead asking both representatives about their species' music, their concepts of beauty, their earliest memories of looking up at the stars. At first, the responses were stiff, formal. But as the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. The Nexians' crystalline structure began displaying color patterns that hadn't been seen in diplomatic meetings before, patterns that indicated curiosity and wonder rather than rigid positioning. The Vortex representative's energy field started resonating with frequencies that their species typically reserve for intimate philosophical discussions. Your species created art before you created faster-than-light travel. The Vortex representative asked the Nexian, their energy field pulsing with genuine interest. We had assumed your aesthetic crystalline forms were a result of technological advancement. They were not. X427 replied, their surface shimmering with what Aisha recognized as pride. Our ancestors spent millennia perfecting the art of conscious crystal formation before we ever reached for the stars. Each pattern tells a story of our people. The Vortex representative swirled thoughtfully. We too have art, though few outside our species would recognize it as such. We create temporal sculptures, moments of perfect energy harmony that exist for just a fraction of a second. Aisha watched and listened, occasionally guiding the conversation, but mostly letting it flow naturally. She had studied both species extensively and had noticed something that centuries of logical negotiation had missed. Both cultures had a deep appreciation for harmony and beauty. They just expressed it differently. The breakthrough came when the Nexian asked to witness one of the Vortex's temporal sculptures. The resulting display of energy patterns interacted with the Nexian's crystalline form in an unexpected way. creating a stunning light show that left both representatives in what could only be described as awe. Your energy patterns, Anx 427 observed, they follow the same mathematical principles as our crystal formations. And your crystalline resonance, the vortex representative replied, it harmonizes with our temporal frequencies in ways we never imagined possible. Within hours, the conversation had shifted from territorial disputes to discussions of joint research projects. The idea of fighting over the Orion Arm seemed suddenly absurd when they could instead explore how their species' unique characteristics could complement each other. When the formal peace treaty was signed a week later, neither side had gotten exactly what they'd originally demanded. Instead, they'd gotten something better, a genuine understanding of each other and the beginning of a collaboration that would benefit both species. How did you know this would work? A junior diplomat asked Aisha afterward. She smiled. Sometimes the most logical thing you can do is set logic aside for a moment. Both species were so focused on winning the argument that they'd forgotten to try understanding each other. All they needed was a reminder that they were more than just their positions in a conflict. The success of what became known as the Dinner Party Protocol led to a revolutionary change in galactic diplomacy. Sometimes the most effective way to resolve a conflict wasn't through careful logical argumentation, but through creating a space where different species could simply be themselves. The emergency meeting of the Galactic Council had been called for an unprecedented purpose: to formally reevaluate humanity's classification in the Galactic Civilization Index. The vast chamber was packed with representatives from every major species, all here to witness what many considered a historic moment. High Counselor Zix stood at the central podium, their bioluminescent patterns shifting through colors that indicated deep contemplation. For centuries, we classified human behavior as primitive, illogical, and potentially dangerous. Recent events have forced us to reconsider this assessment. The holographic displays activated, showing footage from the past few years. Captain Sarah Chen communicating with the Void Whisperers, Maya Rodriguez decoding the ancient quantum network, Dr. James Kumar's symphony solution, and Ambassador Patel's revolutionary approach to diplomacy. What we initially saw as flaws in human thinking, Six continued, we now understand to be a sophisticated adaptation to the true nature of our universe. They don't reject logic. They simply understand its limitations. The Archean representative, whose species had been among the first to encounter humans, raised a crystalline appendage. But their behavior still defies rational analysis. They take unnecessary risks, find patterns where none should exist, and regularly ignore established protocols. Exactly, came a new voice. Dr. Elena Santos, Earth's chief synapsepsychologist, stepped onto the speaking platform. She hadn't been scheduled to speak, and several council members flickered with disapproval at this breach of protocol. But after recent events, they were more willing to listen to unexpected human interventions. What you call logical behavior, Elena explained, is based on the assumption that the universe operates according to fixed, predictable rules. But quantum physics tells us something different. At its most fundamental level, reality is probabilistic, not deterministic. Humans didn't evolve to be illogical. We evolved to be quantum logical. The chamber buzzed with discussion as Elena brought up new holographic displays. Our pattern recognition abilities, our intuition, our comfort with ambiguity. These aren't flaws in our thinking. They're adaptations that allow us to navigate a universe that is far more complex and interconnected than classical logic can accommodate. She gestured to the footage of the Void Whisperers. We can communicate with quantum beings because we naturally think in probabilities and possibilities. We found the ancient network because we don't automatically filter out what seems like noise. We solved the Cassiopeia collapse because we understand that chaos and order are two sides of the same coin. The Vortex representative's energy field pulsed with what had recently been recognized as their equivalent of enthusiasm. The humans' diplomatic innovation also demonstrates this. Their dinner party protocol succeeded precisely because it abandoned rigid logical structures in favor of organic interaction. But more than that, Elena continued, "We've learned that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy have been unconsciously moving toward this way of thinking. The quantum beings, the ancient network builders, even the temporal sculptures of the Vortex Collective, they all represent attempts to transcend the limitations of classical logic." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Humanity hadn't been primitive. They had simply arrived at understandings naturally that other species were only beginning to grasp through thousands of years of technological advancement. "We propose," High Counselor Zix announced, "a new classification for humanity: quantum adaptive cognition. Furthermore, we recommend the establishment of a new galactic institute of nonlinear problem-solving, to be jointly operated by all member species, but with human guidance in its founding principles." The vote was unanimous, a rarity in council proceedings. As the chamber erupted in discussion about the implications of this new understanding, Elena smiled to herself. The galaxy was finally beginning to understand what humans had known instinctively, that true wisdom comes not from rejecting chaos or imposing order, but from learning to dance with both. In the years that followed, this new appreciation for human cognitive approaches led to unprecedented advances across all fields. The integration of human intuition with alien logic created new forms of science, art, and philosophy that neither could have achieved alone. And somewhere in the quantum realm, the Void Whisperers observed it all with what might have been satisfaction. Perhaps they had always known that humanity's seemingly chaotic nature would eventually help bridge the gap between classical and quantum understanding, between logic and intuition, between the known and the unknowable. As Elena liked to say in her lectures at the new institute, the most logical conclusion you can reach about the universe is that it isn't entirely logical. And that's exactly what makes it beautiful.